Today, the New Zealand problem is our problem too. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering funds and prop news with a distinctively Australian flavour. In some ways, New Zealand provides an extreme case study when policy is corrupted by neoliberal values. The result is rising inequality, rising debt, and of course asset booms. And talking of asset booms, CoreLogic in New Zealand says that property prices on average recorded a 1.8% growth in November, making a year-on-year total of, wait for it, 28.4% at a time of COVID and minimal migration. Auckland was up 25.7%, but Christchurch in the South Island was even stronger, up 35.5%. These are nutty numbers. Low interest rates, a rise in first-time buyers, government incentives and easy lending have all played into this. And of course, now the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has been given a mandate to consider the consequences of their policies on home prices, and since then they've taken several steps to try to slow the market. These include lifting the cash rate, tightening macroprudential mortgage controls and issuing this startling projection of future growth, or lack of it. The average property value in New Zealand is now $978,401, with Auckland at $1.4 million and Wellington at $1.1 million, so both more than above $1 million. Over the year to the end of November, the average value of New Zealand homes rose $218,000, with the average home in the country's largest market, Auckland, up $287,000. And in fact, the granular data shows growth across every provincial market. These prices are unsustainable, and the bank's projections may be understating the correction ahead. There are too many households on big loans and with little equity, so this could well turn nasty soon. But there is also a dilemma, which few have commented on. Banks are highly leveraged into property, and if the projected slides do come through, that will put pressure on their capital. New Zealand has the clearest deposit bail-in regime in the Western world, the open banking resolution, and there are minimal protections. And to add to the complexity, the New Zealand Treasury has recently released economic modelling that argues house price growth is actually reducing inequality. You what? The research surprisingly found a 10% increase in house prices decreases wealth inequality across the population. But this is because the wealth of the wealthiest is mostly comprised of non-housing assets. For most other homeowners, housing makes up the most of their wealth. They say the wealth of the richest New Zealanders is a special case, as along with housing and property, they own much of New Zealand's businesses and financial wealth. Non-housing assets are the main component of their wealth, including shares in the stock market. And between June 2018 and June 21, the S&P New Zealand 50 index increased each year by 15.2%, 9.1% and 12.9% respectively, for a total increase of 45%. While total growth in shares looks similar to total growth in median house prices over the last 3 years, the stock market, they say, has been more consistent year over year. So a house price rise gives the home-owning middle class a chance to catch up with the wealthy, they say. Because the majority of householders, around 64%, are homeowners, by the way, a lot of them have mortgages, of course, the narrowing of wealth inequality within this group is large enough for inequality across the population to fall a little. But when house prices rise, the wealth gap between homeowners and non-homeowners widens. A 10% rise in house prices saw the Gini coefficient across the population fall by 0.7 percentage points, from 70.8% to 70.1%, whereas it saw the Gini coefficient between owners and non-owners rise by 0.3 percentage points, from 86.4% to 86.7%. And they also noted the generational divide between homeowners and non-homeowners, and the fact older people have become proportionally wealthier than the younger people in recent years. But they say that the measures of wealth inequality do not tell us about the potential flow and impacts. For example, in the analysis, they've not considered how an increase in the relative wealth of homeowners compared to non-homeowners might affect household spending or saving. However, you can look at how ownership or non-ownership of housing is already associated with being in difficult life circumstances to understand why we might be concerned about an increase in the gap between housing owners and non-owners. So they focus on households who are in material hardship or who have high housing costs, generally greater than 40% of disposable income, as two key indicators of well-being. And they compare the differences between homeowners and non-homeowners to show how the existing wealth disparity between the two groups correlates with households being in these unfavourable circumstances. And they found that 6% of households are non-homeowners in material hardship. Those households have approximately zero wealth, and they are clustered near the bottom of the wealth distribution. There are only 1% of households who own housing and are also in material hardship, and they are clustered around the middle of the wealth distribution. They say this shows there is a strong correlation between non-ownership of housing and being in material hardship. Material hardship is a multi-dimensional and qualitative indicator, which makes it hard to say how an increase in house prices might affect it. There are outstanding questions regarding the drivers of material hardship, including the potential links to high housing costs and low incomes, to help understand how people might move into or out of material hardship. But looking at household housing costs, they find that non-owners are almost twice as likely as owners to have high housing costs. Non-owning households with high housing costs also have very low wealth. While the drivers of owners' and renters' high housing costs may differ, for example, in some cases owners may choose to have high housing costs to pay down their mortgage faster, they say this suggests that there is a relationship between non-ownership of housing, high rental costs, and living in material hardship, which is relevant to any discussion on how increasing house prices might be making it harder for non-owners to get onto the first rung of the wealth ladder in New Zealand. But the modelling only measures house price growth in isolation, when in reality financial assets are also driven by the same fundamental monetary policies. Thus the uber wealthiest asset rise just as fast, if not faster, than the home-owning middle class. So according to the New Zealand Treasury, inequality is measured by comparing the uber-rich against the moderately rich. But what about the rising number of people left renting? The share of ownership versus renting is tilting away from ownership, and the impacts of rising rates on mortgage holders ahead. So this modelling is absolute rubbish, period. It is actually neoliberal claptrap. But it has influenced both governments and central banks for a generation in New Zealand and elsewhere. The economic fallout of years of policy failure and poor monetary policy will come home to roost, and it's not going to be pretty. The truth is that the rich are getting richer thanks to those policies. Debt is rising, and more people have bigger debt for longer, and there is a greater proportion of people excluded from owning property. They probably never will, and they're having to spend more of their incomes to get somewhere to rent because rents are under pressure. Guess why? It's all to do with high costs of property. So we have to short-circuit the neoliberal thinking here and stand back and ask, what sort of society do we want? And to what extent should housing be seen not as an investment class, but as a human right? I actually think that if we started from there and thought about what we needed to do to change the game, we could actually come to a quite different position. But of course, that would blow up neoliberalism, which is political flavour of the century, frankly. And around the world, in New Zealand, in Australia, it is the fundamental reason why we have such a distorted economy. And I'd also make the point that many people cannot spend because they're spending too much on property and housing costs. If we reduce those costs, the economy would be a lot better off. But hey, that is way beyond the pitch of neoliberals. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.